Good morning. I'm Jaime Correa from the School of Architecture. Our moderator this morning will be Jessica Alvarez, and we will have 5 presentations this morning. The first one by Didi Bertrand Farmer. This will be a presentation in which she will talk about Haitians in the island of Abaco in the Bahamas. Second presentation will be by Teofilo Victoria and Ricardo Lopez, a presentation about recovery and recuperation of historic resources in the Bahamas. The third one will be by Steve Fett and myself, Jaime Correa, on the reconstitution of 3 areas of the region of Archaea in Haiti. The fourth, Antonio Tadeo Turanzas Bernard, will show us an adaptation project in Costa Rica. And finally, and we're not short of this, a counter proposal to the overinvestment in design by Kevin Grove. So let's start now. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, my warmest greetings to everyone here today. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's my great honor to join this panel on the topic of race, gender equity, and cultural identity. I thank the symposium organizers for the opportunity to participate, and also my fellow panelists for their contributions to the discussion. My name is Didi Bertrand Farmer. I serve as the managing director for the Miller School of Medicine's Bahamas Partnership Project, initiated in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian in 2019. I'll be speaking on behalf of the partnership team that comprise of myself, Dr. Elizabeth Gregg, Dr. Bart Green, overseen by Dr. Henry Ford, sharing on our experiences both in Haiti and in the Bahamas with regards to the intersections of gender, health, migration, and climate change. Climate change has become a global phenomenon, and among its consequences is the effect on migration. The migrant population accounts for about 3.5% of the world population, half of which are women. So climate change and gender also have deep connections. Climate change affects the livelihood, health, safety, and well-being of millions. There has been an increased risk of severe weather events and natural disasters, prolonged drought, sea level rise, and long-term shifts in weather patterns. The countries that already experience endemic socioeconomic hardships are the hardest hit. Therefore, those who are at greater risk are women and girls. Women and girls carry the heavier burden of its impact due to compounding factors that include increased poverty and widespread inequality, food insecurity and sexual violence, disruption in education and training, amplified existing gender-based health disparities, damage to existing health system and social support, forced migration and internal displacement. Climate change and its effects can also impact pregnancy, access to food and water, access to sexual and reproductive health, mental health, other preventative services such as breast and cervical cancer screening and care for older women, and more. Natural disasters are complex emergencies which exacerbate pre-existing insecurities in the region. We are extremely exposed and vulnerable. Although our countries do not contribute the most to climate change, they are the hardest hit by its effects. We are disproportionately vulnerable to slow onset event and hazard with stronger natural disasters, rise in sea level and temperature, severe drought, changes in food supply, increased waterborne diseases, poor air quality, forest degradation, decrease in biodiversity, and most of all increase in community vulnerability. For example, in my country, Haiti, 1/3 of the population lives in coastal zone, a total of 7% of arable land face great threat of flood due to sea level rise. From the 1990s to 2000s, the average number of tropical storms has increased to about 70 per year. The rural population has decreased from 79% in 1982 to 52% in 2010 and 43% in 2019, according to the World Bank. Sea level rise prediction range from 0.5 to 0.7 by 2031, which is only 10 years from now, and from 0.2 to 1.1 by 2071, according to UNDP. Climate change also exposes and exacerbates these countries' weak infrastructures and systems. Examples of these are inequitable healthcare and education provision, lack of regulation and building codes, unstable or corrupt government, long-term environmental changes that disrupt livelihoods and impede access to food and water, widespread displacement, rural to urban migration, uncoordinated system of aid, which manifests in disorganized response to crises, migration to neighborhood coastal countries, etc. The World Bank found that Haiti experienced more natural disasters per square kilometer than any other country in the Central America and the Caribbean. The cascading impact of multiple humanitarian emergencies have weakened the country's ability to adequately rebuild. Research findings from Marcelin and colleagues stated that just under 15 years, Haiti has experienced 8 major disasters, including Hurricane Matthew in 2016, affecting more than half of its population, which took over 200,000 lives. One of the major disasters was the January 2010 earthquake that struck Haiti, with an epicenter just 25 kilometers southwest of the capital city, Port-au-Prince, which claimed 300,000 lives and injured 300,000 more. Over 1.5 million Haitians were internally displaced, many of whom lived in informal camps and settlements. Within these settlements, women and girls faced greater vulnerability and risk for sexual violence and rape. In the 10 years following the 2010 earthquake, Haiti has experienced an almost constant succession of humanitarian disasters, ranging from the cholera outbreak to Hurricane Matthew, to widespread political uprising, and now the COVID-19 pandemic. All these have physical and psychological consequences, cause economic devastation, prolonged disruption in education, which is especially challenging for Haitian adolescent girls and young women. Forced displacement into informal settlement where sanitary, potable water, electricity, all basic necessities are lacking. All these really put people at heightened risk for safety. So migrant populations are especially vulnerable following disasters. Climate refugees are forced to migrate due to cascading effects of climate change that increase people's vulnerabilities, but also due to political, social, and economic insecurity. In addition to internal migration, there is widespread migration out of the region, particularly to coastal countries. For example, out of some 10 to 15,000 Haitians that migrate to the Abaco, the Bahamas, 41% of documented Haitians and 20% of undocumented Haitians lived in either the mud or pigeon peas of Shantytown, which was a geographically isolated settlement that lacked adequate infrastructure nor followed building regulations. So when Dorian struck, the area came to complete destruction and many lives were lost. Dorian hit the Bahamas as a Category 5 hurricane in September 2019 and caused widespread devastation throughout the Abaco and Grand Bahama, the two northwest islands of the country. Dorian was the second strongest storm in the history of the island that affected an estimated 22,000 people. Groups with extreme vulnerability following disasters include single mothers, housing insecure or migrant women, women with disabilities, elderly women, and adolescent girls. Women bear the greater burden after Dorian, ranging from family separation to provision and care for children and elderly to violence and abuse. The shanty town, home to Haitian migrant population, were hard hit by Hurricane Dorian. Heightened stigma and discrimination following the hurricane lead to less access to social support or relief services. Haitian migrants have no clear path toward durable solutions for their integration in the country. The shanty town was reappropriated, and they lack access to land and other means to rebuild their lives. Haitian migrant women, especially those that are undocumented, are extremely vulnerable. They face immense challenges accessing social services, including in the formal healthcare sector, because of fear of deportation and xenophobia. They cannot secure government assistance and are unable to access social safety net and systems. They are at heightened risk of physical and sexual violence at temporary shelters, and also lack access to safe water, food, and sanitation facilities. Their children's education is disrupted. The loss of fragile employment or financial opportunities may push them to survival sex work as an option to keep alive. The lack of security and sense of place put these women at great risk for depression and anxiety, and also other mental disorders. We spoke with some who were living in church ground turned into shelters, and they talked about the painful experience of one loss and struggle after the other. Displaced from Haiti to the Abacos to find themselves displaced again within the Abacos after Hurricane Dorian. So an already uncertain future became even more uncertain overnight. According to the World Health Organization, about 1.3 billion people in low and middle income countries live below the poverty line, and 70% of them are female. Climate change consequences disproportionately affect the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, a majority of which are women. It amplifies gender-based inequalities and health disparities, and devastates economic opportunities for women who may have gained some financial autonomy in working in industries related to agriculture, food production, or tourism. But following natural disasters or other humanitarian crises, women and girls, including migrant women, are too often left on the fringes of the response. So we need to move forward. We need to move towards a solution that is regional, structural, and equitable. We need a regional framework to create a sustainable and just future for all through strong partnerships and collaborations. And a more equitable response to climate emergencies also requires investment. Investment in equitable and sound policy actions, investment in restructuring, not merely rebuilding existing systems, the educational, health, socioeconomic systems, and more. We need an equity-driven approach with attention to the disproportionate risk and responsibility of each country in regards to global climate change. We need to move towards the solutions that also increase women and girls' involvement in the climate response. Both globally and locally, women and girls, all groups, must have the opportunity to become more involved in the response to disasters and mitigation of climate change. Resilience also requires more equitable policy actions that make gender integral and central to disaster risk reduction. It requires us to address social determinants of health in order to allow for more sustainable solutions. We must also address health system challenges affected by neocolonialism and structural adjustment. Investment in young people is another element. Investment, especially in young women and girls, is salient as we continue to witness more severe weather and increase in the feminization of poverty. It also requires us to understand and accept the fact that women are most vulnerable to and impacted by climate change and severe events. This is the pathway for a gender and environmental justice agenda. Now, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share with you this morning. Merci beaucoup. Looking forward to the discussions.
Good afternoon. My name is Teofilo. I'm a faculty member of the School of Architecture. And together with Professor Ricardo Lopez, we've been conducting a series of studios, workshops, and seminars on the cultural, patrimonial legacies of the built environment in the Grand Caribbean. This presentation consists of a studio and a historic American building survey conducted in 2018 and 2019. The presentation is in two parts. One is dedicated to the study of the cultural patrimonial site of the town of Hopetown, founded at the end of the 18th century in Elbow Key. And the second part consists of the efforts being done in documenting the governor's residence in the in Dunmore town in Harbor Island, Eleuthera. The Bahamas sits slightly northeast of the Caribbean basin, and it is an archipelago consisting of 600 islands practically, or something like this, depends how you define an island, that is characterized by Ulitic limestone promontories, reefs, pineland, and most extraordinary, this is great sandbanks that in fact influence or are at the origin of the name Bahamas, which stems from Bahama, which is a sounding term used by the Europeans when they first arrived at the Caribbean. In fact, it's through the Bahamas that the Europeans reached the Caribbean Sea and thus the New World theoretically. But you can see here the little Bahamas bank towards the north, towards the top, and towards the bottom, the Great Bahamas bank. And in this National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration chart, we can see as a sounding map in phantoms, and you can see the positioning of the sandbanks, which are in fact along the Atlantic Ocean edge that these two towns that we're studying are built. Dunmore Town in Harbor Island and Hopetown in the Abacos. On September the 1st, 2019, Hurricane Dorian made landfall in Hopetown, in fact, in this town founded towards the end of the 18th century by loyalists fleeing the American Revolution. And the consequences of it were dire, as we can see here in this video taken a month after the onslaught of the storm, or the storm having made landfall a few miles north of Marsh Harbor in the town of Hopetown. And you can see that the destruction is thorough. It's the city had to be evacuated actually, and it's the question of how and why is of course still being pursued. But there is though a remarkable difference between the fate of Marsh Harbor and Freeport as well in the Grand Bahamas and the fate of these historic towns like Hopetown. As you can see here, this is at the same time. This is the same visit as to March Harbor in the video that was shown a moment ago. The town is practically intact. I mean, it survives the storm, damaged, of course, but the city does not have to be evacuated. So in the studio, we conducted a series of studies to not only address the issue of the conservation of historical patrimony, but to see if we could learn the why and the how that these towns survived so plainly after these epic momentous occasion of landfall of Hurricane Dorian. Towards the left is a map of the Abacos, and towards the right is a town of Hopetown with the street pattern and the collection of buildings. We developed a survey map to conduct a sidewalk survey to categorize the extent of the damage done to the town. We also photographed at the time by means of collaborating with other groups doing work in Hopetown, and to study the town and the extent of the damage from an aerial perspective. And we see the importance of the location of the town and the geological condition of the section of the town, with the ocean towards the right-hand side of this picture frame, and the Abaco or the Hopetown Bay or Hopetown Harbor towards the left-hand side. Well, from this cadastral drawing from the 1927, we also are able to see not only the configuration of plots in the urban pattern of the town, but these essential and fundamental guiding principle of the settlement, which is a single street along the ridge that, at the point of the jib, forks to allow access towards the bay. And we studied this condition. We studied it in plan, and we studied it as well in terms of the typologies employed in the town. And we studied the civic center as well in terms of the configuration of buildings and the street sections and the locations with respect to each other and within the scope of the ridge in terms of its general location. We understood as well that it's not merely the ridge and the elevation that the ridge provides, which is where the main street is located, but the importance of the dune and the integrity of the dune and the dune vegetation, of course, which, by the way, is a very diverse and beautiful landscape. And we studied too the sand as a device for harvesting water in terms of filtering water and as a pervious surface, and of course the methods of construction in wood brace frame examples that you find throughout Harbor Island. In this case, there's a drawing of an elevation measured in floorboards towards the right-hand side. In the portions of the town that sustained the greatest degree of damage were the lower points, points that actually shared the elevation of the mean high water line. And in one of these sites, we propose new construction based on the lessons that we have learned from wood frame construction in general, and apply these as a means of arriving at a codification, possibly, of how to build in these towns. We also explored other sites in Elbow Key. Hopetown is built in the island of Elbow Key to see where we could find appropriate sites, ridges, and sites for new settlements that would relieve the pressure on the town center. And lastly, we are considering now the publication of these findings in the form of a SIN. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teofilo. I will now share my screen to talk about the lessons of resilience through the documentation of historic buildings. Defining resilience, that which survives, persists, Buildings that survive the physical stresses of natural disaster offer lessons for architects who are to compose new buildings in similar regional and local contexts. Identifying the threshold between buildings that fail after a climatological event and those that perform successfully, one can more closely approximate the definition of resilient buildings and cities. In the aftermath of a direct hit by Category 5 Hurricane Dorian, it was apparent that the historic wood frame houses of Hopetown performed exceedingly well compared to their post-war counterparts at nearby Marsh Harbor. The compact siding of buildings up on the ridge, the flexibility of the braced frame construction, the elevation of the structure from the ground, the tight roof eaves, and the operable shutters all contributed to the resilient nature of these buildings. The oldest house on the island, situated on the beach but behind the dune, suffered only minor exterior damage. While the storm surge surely flooded the interior, the water would have quickly drained out through the same floorboards the water came in. And where are we to find resilient buildings? These historic settlements, given the annual cycle of tropical storms in the Western Atlantic Ocean, those historic settlements whose building stock has withstood year after year of tropical sun, rain, and wind, are worthy of closer examination. In particular, the loyalist settlements of the Bahamas offer insight to resilient design strategies for towns and buildings in the face of extreme weather patterns. These include site planning, urbanism, architectural composition, structural systems, building materials and technology, passive cooling systems, culture, and economy, all of which are discernible and pertinent throughout the region. Knowing by drawing. To observe, measure, and record the physical characteristics of a building is to memorialize it, to remember it, and to cognitively know the building. The author of a measured drawing acquires knowledge of a building directly from the source and therefore begins the process, according to Bloom's taxonomy, to create new knowledge. The Historic American Building Survey is not only there as a catalog of US patrimony, but also serves as a platform for students of architecture to learn about buildings. The School of Architecture at the University of Miami has offered students the HABS course as part of the preservation certificate for many years. Building subjects have been primarily local, but do include buildings in the Bahamas, Cuba, and even Curacao. The coastal settlements in the Bahamas adapted wood frame building techniques from the American colonies to the demands of the subtropical islands. Porches and shutters were integrated to the architectural compositions to offer protection from sun, wind, and rain, while abandoning the chimney and fireplace. The Residency in Dunmore Town on Harbor Island is not only a building of high cultural value for the community, but offers many valuable lessons in resilience for architects working in the region today. Its favorable site upon the island's ridge was the home of Lord Dunmore, governor of Virginia at the time of the American Revolution, who fled the American colonies and was recommissioned to the Bahamas. The outstanding verandas, which provide abundant shade and rain protection, are deep enough to accommodate outdoor activities beyond just circulation. Over the years, inappropriate incursions have been made, but the bones are all still there. Recently, the structure has fallen into disuse, and its lack of maintenance, coupled with the increasingly strong and frequent weather events, have led to the building's decay, particularly at the veranda's upper floor and roof deck. In collaboration with local partners such as the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation of the Bahamas and the University of the Bahamas, the University of Miami has engaged in pursuit of a restoration project, beginning with a HABS documentation. Recently, the School of Architecture has also worked with the Institute of Data Science and Computing to integrate newer technologies to the coursework. With just 2 full working days, our group of 11 undergraduate students set out to capture enough information to produce a complete set of existing conditions drawings. While access to the upper floor was very limited, students managed to get critical dimensions they needed by methodically making their way around the entire building with measuring tapes and pencils in hand. Following the standards of HABS, they recorded building dimensions and notes on large format graph paper with great detail and clarity. Those field notes served as the basis for producing architectural drafts that describe all of the building's major components. For example, this foundation plan reveals that the stone walls of the masonry core of the building protect a cistern, which may have served a communal role given the site's location at the highest point in the settlement. The building section reveals a typical Bahamian roof, steep enough for an attic space to provide thermal insulation, and set onto the structural walls with no overhang, but with a second, more shallow roof over the porch, or in this case, a wraparound veranda. And even though the house is at the top of the ridge, there's an adequate crawl space for ventilation and access to the cistern. Incorporating drone-mounted cameras to our toolbox allowed us to better understand the vertical dimensions of the roof and the expanse of the site. Here we see the residency with its decaying veranda roof, and at the center of the historic settlement, high above the coastline, with North Eleuthera in the distance. The aerial photographs were then processed back on campus to produce aerial and frontal photogrammetry, which are pictures without any perspectival distortion, photos that can be measured with great accuracy once back at home. Furthermore, the data collected on site yielded a 3D point cloud that could be referred to back in the studio, facilitating the production of the 2D drawings. The point cloud captures both the hard dimensions that the students need, but also the color and light we're accustomed to expect from photographs. Advancing the technology for the representation of buildings in both 2D and 3D has long been a pursuit of architects. This engraving of the Villa Caprarola represents a building perspectively, while also revealing the building's floor plan and building section, critical for an architect to truly know and understand a building. Due to the pandemic, we were unable to travel to Hopetown with the students last year, but we were able to visit the Coconut Grove Schoolhouse, a Bahamian building right here in Miami. We were also able to test out a new LiDAR scanner. This point cloud was produced far more quickly and in a format that is easier to analyze and manipulate. Here we see an orthographic slice through the point cloud. While imperfect, it does reveal with true dimensions the same characteristics of braced frame wood construction to be found in the oldest houses in Hopetown. If we are to educate architects about coastal resilience, we can identify those places that have demonstrated resilience through natural disasters, and we can provide an opportunity to collect the data necessary to produce architectural drawings while incorporating the most effective technology to do so. Thank you very much.
A paradigm for regional reconstruction, the recovery of the Archaea region, presented and read by Jaime Correa and Steve Fett at the School of Architecture of the University of Miami. For the citizens of Haiti, the earthquake of 2010 was a sign of wreckage in a country destined to self-destruct. For the rest of the world, it was a source of human empathy without precedent. Complete state of desperation, it only took a few days for Haiti to become the poster NGO investment nation in the world. Funded by the Kellogg and Bayer Foundations, the Center for Urban and Community Design of the University of Miami assembled a team of architects, urban designers, housing specialists, landscape architects, environmental engineers, and students to produce design concepts which will augment the resiliency of one region of the island. Given the kind of physical, socioeconomic, and environmental destruction northwest from Port-au-Prince, the region of Arcahaie became our focal point. The goal was to produce a comprehensive regional master plan with targeted proposals for the restoration of urban areas, rural areas, and fishing resources for the archetypal reconstruction of a large city, Arcahaie, a medium-sized hamlet, Correa, and an informal fish village, Luli, and for infrastructure projects containing basic human services. It is our hope that our methodology can become a paradigm of resilient design for other regions of the world. We will present a timeline of discoveries which grew incrementally from vague preliminary proposals to concrete projects for the urban reconstitution of civic areas, hospitals, and schools offering vocational training. The method, a characteristic of the School of Miami, comprised numerous visits to the sites, meetings with residents and public officials, public education sessions, assessments of findings, design workshops, and the final production of the proposed work. Perhaps the most exceptional aspect of the project was its capacity to translate cultural values into physical proposals, proposals which are charged with collective meaning and values. The results were presented graphically with the same type of vivid naivete found in Haitian folk art, and which nevertheless is based on precise theories and development methods dating back to the pre-revolutionary period. The Archaea region is famous for its beaches, its agriculture and fishing industries, and for the cultural ethos of its urban and rural residences. Residents. Despite these attributes, prior to the earthquake of 2010, infrastructure projects never materialized. The distance to high schools and universities made advanced education unattainable for most. Those who could often left permanently. And the lack of access to vocational education started the growth of the region, and similarly, medical care was extremely deficient. The heart of this situation is the lack of opportunities for talented youth. And yet, in the middle of this conflict, numerous opportunities also emerged. The University of Miami team had prior experience in Haiti. From those experiences, we learned that building medical and educational facilities had immediate transformational effects on the structure of physical environments and on the production of socioeconomic fitness. We were also troubled by the poor conditions of existing public spaces and by the lack of direct connection between urban, rural form and civic infrastructure. In a country without a coherent trash collection program, public spaces became the de facto dumpsters, as did swells, medians, and shorelines. The waterfront area in the town of Arcahaie could be the place for a great waterfront plaza, and nevertheless, it was not now a polluted area inappropriately placed at the town's main entrance from the water. A series of public educational meetings follow our discoveries, and little by little, our team fostered a new mindset of community ownership and sense of pride. We proposals to relocate a central market, create a colossal plaza, infill residential lots, refurbish the historic civic center of the city, and provide a new health and educational infrastructure were among the physical strategies used for the reconstitution of what was perceived as a huge place without a future. The territory of Haitian cities and countrysides was based on the French Arpent system of land distribution, a system which divides the landscape into long rags of land perpendicular to the water. An arpent was the unit of length used by the French to measure lots along the coastlines of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. One arpent was the equivalent of approximately 12 English rods of 16 feet each, or the typical length of the chain holding the anchor of a French sailing boat. Very narrow and long arpents are the fundamental DNA of the French Haitian city and countryside. The best cities and rural areas in the country happen to correspond with the rationality of this land distribution. For thousands of years, communities have followed objective and pragmatic principles of design and construction in the creation of meaningful places. Their archetypal character and their geometric order were not the result of particular whims, but the product of numerable physical interactions and vernacular trials and errors. Therein lays their wisdom and relevance. We use similar principles of design for the physical interventions in Correa and Lully. In these two cases, we employ the typology of a typical housing compound called a la coup, which is a Haitian housing typology configured as a walled-in compound with single-room buildings occupying the periphery of a lot while leaving central spaces for the social benefit of the extended families within. These compounds were retranslated to contemporary conditions within the lot, the neighborhood, the city, and the regional level. What in the original was a small courtyard became retranslated as a social gathering space at the level of the neighborhood, public space at the level of the city, or a distribution center at a larger regional scale. Throughout history, architects and urban designers have used geometric universal principles to create memorable and significant urban spaces and architecture. At the risk of vagueness, we would like to offer a compendium of 10 among the most important of these principles: clarity of figure ground, creation of centers, inner calm and balance, differences of scale, clear boundaries and contrast, slight irregularities, repetition and redundancies, ambiguities, solidity in the acceptance of gravity, connections and networks, and cultural uniqueness. Analogous to the interventions in the city of Arcahaie, the small town of Correa and Lully, also were given a variety of unique solutions for the benefit of its residents in accordance with the particulars of their location. We verified and understood that a recovery of local traditions in combination with universal geometries was fundamental for the production of new physical developments and for the rehabilitation of existing urban places and spaces. It is certainly true that industrialization and technology can accomplish all kinds of things very cheaply, efficiently, and quickly, but that does not necessarily imply that our new independent interventions or our new intellectual advances are lovely, filled with life, or meant to create human environments of comfort and beauty. That was precisely what we wanted to achieve: memorable and lovely places to live, work, and succeed.
The small town of Luli is set at the foothills of a jagged mountain range that abruptly transitions into a bountiful plain, beautiful and green, and at the heart of Haiti's plantain farming industry. The hills are populated by thousands who live in small, underserved settlements without access to formal education or medical facilities. Luli is at its densest along the waterfront, the Canal de Saint-Marc, overlooking the island of Gonave. It is precisely at this location where the region's busiest fish market is located. Yet the lack of available electricity rules out the possibility of refrigeration, and day by day the seas are overfished, creating a chain reaction resulting in a dangerous loss of habitat. One fateful morning, after a chance encounter over breakfast at a seaside hotel with leaders in global development at the State University of New York, we set out with our partners from Youth Build International to inspect a property we were all considering for purchase and the development of a vocational school. Shortly after this breakfast, two caravans, one of Sunni personnel, the other ours, left the hotel simultaneously, heading out for the day. The vans continued for miles in tandem before pulling off the national road onto two adjacent sites, shown here. Miraculously, both teams were looking to purchase land to develop educational facilities. Discovery of this almost unbelievable coincidence fostered further exchange, and soon both sides realized that a collaboration was mutually beneficial. We showed Sunni our report and plans, and this, in short, was the foundation of a partnership. This meant that our initial plans for a small youth-build vocational school to be built on a fraction of a 5-acre parcel, shown in these three images, could be expanded to over 40 acres with the help of Sunni and its core partners. The design of the Sustainable Village and Learning Community, or the SVLC, started with the same kind of community meetings used in the production of the general master plans. These public meetings were led by a cross-disciplinary team of architects and engineers from the University of Miami and the College of Environmental Science and Forestry at SUNY. From these meetings, the design team learned the strengths and opportunities afforded by the site itself. The list of regional economic opportunities with the greatest interest included construction, nursing, hospitality, applied technology, agriculture, and the performing arts. Presently, the SVLC's design and economic planning phase is complete and funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and supported by a group of 5 core partners, both Haitian and American, all dedicated to strengthening conditions that propel the vulnerable to achieve success. Equipped with this knowledge and financial backing, a development team at SUNY prepared a phased building program focused on vocational training with an emphasis on fiscal sustainability. The coursework will focus on entrepreneurial training, targeting community demand for goods and services, in addition to training the future educators and builders of the SVLC itself and beyond. The SVLC will be located just north of the National Road. It is strategically located and able to service the town of Luli, the hilltop settlements, and cast a regional draw via its proximity to the highway. The new buildings are comprised of a combination of classroom spaces, incubator workshops, and for-profit business ventures on the periphery of the lot, with a central public space for the benefit of the community. An approximately 2-degree slope from the bottom to the top of the 40-acre parcel allows for relatively simple construction practices while creating opportunities for broad views to the sea. Our collaboration with SUNY's School of Environmental Science and Forestry gave us the reassurance that the SVOC could be sustainable in terms of water management and energy production. We predict that we can supply enough power to the learning community if we utilize 60% of roof surface areas for photovoltaics. This, coupled with low-tech energy reduction solutions such as shallow building depths, operable windows, and flexible covered outdoor spaces, help reduce the energy demand. In the same tradition of the Laku, courtyard housing compounds, the perimeter block creates a secure and controllable frontage line along the street. The repetitive use of this native typology lets the street stay open to the public rather than necessitating the building of a gate around the entire campus. This was perhaps the argument we had to work on the hardest with our constituents. The result is a campus that feels like a town and in fact can grow into one organically. The street sections are wide, inviting the informality in life so distinct in Haitian towns. Despite our good intentions and our temptation to declare an imminent success, what we call a paradigmatic approach for a regional reconstruction shares the same kind of obstacles faced by many humanitarian missions around the world. No matter the size of the generous donations from individuals and nations around the world, Haiti remains impoverished. Paradoxically, the effect of new projects, particularly of those characterized as helicoptered in, have left Haitians in even less control of their own destiny. The feeling of being given what others believe is needed does not allow much room for participation and growth. There is a Haitian proverb that says, "There are mountains beyond mountains," understood as the typical condition that when you solve one problem, there's another that will present itself. Without empowerment and participation and partnership, there can be no pride in collective ownership. Sustainable and resilient successes in the region will not be measured by projects, but by capacity building, a capacity that will help communities to recover quickly from the enormous difficulties they face, an elastic capacity to spring back into shape via self-sufficiency and self-respect for simple development traditions and principles of design. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Antonio. I'm from Costa Rica, and I will expose you my presentation project called The Adaptation of a Coastal Community in Costa Rica to Climate Change. I began to study the geological stage in which we find ourselves to understand the context in which we live today. So we currently live in this new stage called the Anthropocene. At this stage, the human footprint in the biosphere has turned us into agents that shape the Earth. And this is distinguished from any other by having rapid changes in ecosystems around the world, marked by the acceleration of the climate change. These accelerations and changes took me to the community of Cal located on the coast of Costa Rica. These alterations, we can see it along the time, are affected the community, not only by changing the morphology and the ecosystems, but also the dynamics of the families are affected by these transformations. In Central America, Costa Rica is one of the countries with the largest number of people affected by this change, especially rise in the sea level. In the Cocal, it is estimated that there could be more than 1,000 annual floods. And the sea level rise, the erosion, and the flooding are the three main environmental issues that need to be alleviated. Historically, they cause several damage to the island, and they will continuously influence the development of the village. Today, it is flooded 42 times per year. And this is why the institutions and the community needs to rethink the defense against the risk and rather adapt to it in a resilient way, in conjunction with natural processes. The people in a certain way have already survived this kind of changes, with it needing as much support. By working together and using reused materials, they are able to generate these spaces like parks before some floodings. And this generates some challenges of how do we able to coexist and accept these realities, not see them as problems, but as changing conditions and opportunities. In this place, the change is a constant. And the constant is working with the community all the time. To address these challenges, an academic project is proposed, but with a direct involvement with the people of Cocal, for which a series of participatory processes were carried out for the purpose of understanding the culture of the users, their lifestyles, jobs, states, and analyze and preserve local traditions. We work in three main scales: Isla Quepos, Punta Arenas, Isla Damas, y la Comunidad del Cocal. And also in three different ecosystems: the sea, the coast, and the mangrove. They three working together with the community. We're using ecosystem services of the place, of provisioning, regulating, habitat, and cultural services to develop a master plan that's trying to maintain the integrity, the connectivity, and the functioning of ecosystems, seeking to adapt, restore, and repair damaged ecosystems while facilitating our human field development with ecological acceptable limits. They are divided in 5. Each of these strategies creates an environmental and social opportunity for the community, all in relation to the training of local workforce. So the relocation, recovery, protection, accessibility, and the community support projects are in relation with the programs of the artificial reefs, road barriers, the living coast, adaptive parks, the houses, and more. The first one, the relocation of structures in the risk zone. So the coasts are in a constant process of metamorphosis, but we are generating in our cities infrastructures that are closed or static systems that paralyze the variability to systems to adapt. Therefore, certain structures are mobilized in the area to try to recover mangrove areas and generating certain changes in those spaces to activate resilient processes. So we can see a look of the houses and some of the barriers that they are used to prevent these floatings. But we're changing that with the wave distribution system and the relocation of the house. Then the recovery of the mangrove. This is one of the most threatened ecosystems in the tropics, mainly due to the anthropogenic causes. In Costa Rica, naturally, the mangrove cannot recede to the rise in the sea level due to the development of urbanizations, streets, and mainly cultivated areas. This leads to the loss of these forests, and therefore the mangrove and the community are exposed to the alterations of climate change. We can see a look that the mangrove of Damas and Boca Vieja in the Cocal, they lost 50% of this area. So a recovery of the mangrove restoration strategies that integrate social, economic, and ecological aspects were used with the planning, implementation, and the evaluation of the site. With the different spatial and temporal scales of 5 years, 10 years, 20, and more years. The perception and the participation of the community are fundamental of the continuity of the project through the conservation and the maintenance of this program. The protection, we use the breakwaters and the living coast. The breakwaters, these type of breakwater have several advantages, such as a reduction of the visual impact, a smaller volume of materials, and they present a low reflection, which favors the conditions of organisms need to form colonies in these refugee areas. The coconut fiber logs are used with the local materials and provide a sedimentary retention that helps create the new habitats. So the coconut fiber logs are used along the shoreline to provide better erosion control while generating new habitats. And we can see a look of the internal zone, the erosion control, the roads and paths, and the natural wave protection. The accessibility, This begins with the identification of the site, existing routes, and the potential of the new ones. The new ones become natural trails, linking the new green spaces with the larger habitats such as mangroves. The beach access are marked every 100 meters, since the area is also used to turtle nest. Certain areas are custom areas in protection. Another one are used to give access to another spaces. Then the community support projects, the design of the house and the public spaces. Before designing the house, we studied the topology in Quepos, and we see the houses of the United Fruit Company. These are normally built in what we are called ciudades bananeras, or banana cities, which has an architecture that represents an adaptation of tropical climates, taking into account the context in which it is located. In this area, the complicity relationship between the environment, the housing, and inhabitants is essential, and taking into account the daily activities, temporally and local dynamics, without forgetting the local values, which can become an expression of the identity of the area. An important space is that is formed between the land and the house, thanks to the height of the columns, which rise at the house 2.5 meters. This area is used like a part of a family economic activation, where the cocoa families can use it to sell their own products. In a way, these strategies not only protect the people and the ecosystems, but also at the same time regenerate adaptive systems, absorbing the effects of changes in prevailing environmental conditions while maintaining their structures and functions. If you saw all the strategies our design operations, the community plays a fundamental role for the operation and the restoration of the place. It goes from an overall vision where people are as managers of these ecosystem services, which makes the design strategies possible. And we're preserving and generating the spirit of the place, health well-being, the leadership strategy, and the economic society. So we can see that the current landscapes when the mangrove are closing area with the house invasions, no parks, no recreational spaces, homes near the coastal line, and no coast protection. With the new projected landscape, we can see that we release a connection between the community and the mangrove with mangrove path, the natural parks, the new design of the house, recreation areas, open spaces, shoreline management, and living breakwaters. These strategies are working as a territorial strategy that integrates the conservation and the restoration of ecosystem to provide services that allow people to adapt to the effects of climate change while increasingly resilience. The levels of adaptability of the human being in these spaces are prioritized. The landscape is working as a collective process where the community participates in the design process. The person is not seen as a user, but rather they become a project managers. Some obstacles in these projects in the coastal resilience are many. Some lack of political or economic awareness are of the effects of the climate change. Politics or some infrastructure here, Costa Rica, continue their path without paying attention to the development of plans or manage of the response of the communities to climate change or climate events. So that's why we are generating a risk reduction, a cohabit, and ecology. All of this is in relation with the resilience and adaptation of the island. Thanks you for listening to me, and that's all.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Grove, geography professor at Florida International University. On behalf of my co-authors, Savannah Cox from UC Berkeley and Elaine Barnett from FIU, we'd like to thank the organizers of the symposium for bringing us all together today. Our talk is on race, resilience, and the limits of design-driven resilience planning in Greater Miami. So, what is a resilient Miami? In a city faced with rising seas and increasingly frequent sunny-day flooding, and whose struggles with water are amplified by sensationalist global media coverage about a drowning city, this question might seem simple. Making Miami resilient means upgrading stormwater infrastructure, installing pumps, building seawalls, perhaps even raising roads, or installing green infrastructure, such as living shorelines. We might also go a step further and say that we need institutional changes that encourage various local government agencies to step out of their siloed workflow, engage across sectoral divides, and incorporate long-term planning. All of these actions have been part of recent resilient initiatives in Miami. But many of these solutions hinge on an implicit understanding of what both resilient and Miami mean. A resilient Miami of hardened gray and green infrastructure makes sense if resilience is a technical problem of future sea level rise that imperils property value and insurability. And this makes sense if Miami refers to a complex urban system whose reliable functioning is threatened by external environmental changes. But what a resilient Miami might be looks very different if we question these implicit assumptions. After all, Miami is a region in which the production of wealth through real estate development, rental housing, and high-end tourism depends on shifting forms of racial segregation, anti-Black violence, and racially exclusionary governance that has institutionalized a zero-sum approach to local politics, which ensures local government action benefits white identifying downtown development interests. This means that for many minority, racial, and ethnic communities, questions of social and ecological vulnerability and insecurity do not lie in a distant, waterlogged future, but rather suffuse present conditions of everyday life. Social and climate justice advocacy groups have driven public interest in unconventional resilient initiatives, such as the Miami Forever Bond and its Citizens Oversight Board, and they're producing alternative resilience plans, such as the Miami Climate Alliance's Housing Justice is Climate Justice statement. Their actions demonstrate a resilient Miami is just as much a question of everyday insecurities as it is a question of securing future property values. So in this paper, we bring together literatures on critical resilience studies, design theory, and Black geographies to examine how resilience planning in Greater Miami is situated in relation to these diverse styles of resilience. Focusing on the 100 Resilient Cities planning process, we asked how techniques of design-driven resilience make histories of racial violence, segregation, and exclusion legible to governmental knowledge, intervention, and control. This enables us to examine resilience not as a coherent policy agenda or transparent technical problem, but as a site of political struggle, which places ethical and political demands on social and ecological difference. Our analysis demonstrates how techniques of design-driven resilience attempt to make complex histories of racial and environmental violence transparent as partial and bounded interests that can be pragmatically synthesized with other equally bounded interests. This has the effect, we argue, of ontologizing difference. It renders social and ecological difference an ontological quality, the way a complex world simply is, rather than recognizing how difference has been produced through contested histories of struggle that continue to shape vulnerabilities and insecurities today. So the 100 Resilient Cities planning process in Miami provides an interesting case to examine how historical, social, and political factors intersect with future-oriented, systemically focused resilience initiatives. From 2016 to 2019, the region's 3 major local governments participated in the 100 Resilient Cities program under the umbrella Greater Miami and the Beaches, or GMB. In consultation with Rockefeller staff and design consultants from Arab, GMB published a 2017 preliminary resilience assessment, and in 2019 launched the Resilient 305 Resilience Strategy, which identifies and harmonizes resilience actions across the region. The Resilient 305 strategy stands out for the way it positions equity as a cross-cutting theme. Few other participating cities in 100 RC integrated equity into their resilience strategies, so it's noteworthy to see this in a city with a long history of racial turmoil like Miami. As architect Correa Reed emphasizes, there are multiple Miamis, distinct social worlds of extreme luxury, wealth, and leisure that exist alongside extreme poverty, insecurity, and abandonment. As we've demonstrated elsewhere, these worlds are intimately intertwined, constituted through racializing assemblages that sustain capital accumulation in the metropolitan region through the production and management of racial difference. They've also shaped distinct visions of resilience introduced in our introduction here. First, what we call centripetal resilience, a future-oriented vision of resilience focused on transforming the built environment to withstand threats extreme weather poses to property values. This is a vision of resilience centered on the interests and concerns of white identifying development interests. Second, what we call centrifugal resilience decenters this focus on property value and emphasizes diverse experiences of everyday harm and insecurities. This is a vision of resilience shared by many social and climate justice organizations and their allies in local government that have been mobilizing around the concept in order to draw attention to long ignored issues such as affordable housing, public transportation, and climate gentrification. Literature in the field of Black geographies helps theorize these distinct visions of resilience. Specifically, this work allows us to imagine resilience from what Catherine McKittrick calls the perspective of struggle. Centrifugal visions of resilience animate what Clyde Woods calls specialized geographical knowledge, alternative forms of knowledge grounded in the experience of recurring racial violence, which cannot be fully accessed or comprehended through Western scientific methods. These are forms of knowledge and subjectivity that, in the words of Harney and Moten, cut the regulatory force of formal institutionalized knowledge and its deployment in various governance arrangements. Where governance attempts to render all aspects and spaces and subjects transparently knowable and governable through the identification of interests that can be addressed through policy, Black geographies signal subject positions forged through centuries of racial violence, whose existence undermines the possibility of governance itself, because their exclusion from the figure of humanity historically conditioned the white liberal subject of interests. So from a perspective of struggle, centrifugal visions of resilience index historical and current experiences of dehumanizing, socially and spatially uneven vulnerabilities that sustain the production of value in the local economy. We turn now to explore how design-driven resilience techniques attempt to render this racialized difference transparent to governmental knowledge and control. So one of the defining factors of the 100 RC program is how it allows member governments to construct, or more accurately design, their own operationalized definition of resilience. So this figure depicts the resilience planning timeline that guided the design process of GMB's resilience strategy. The first step was a kickoff event that brought together multiple stakeholder groups. In Miami, the event included 200 participants from local government, civil society, and the private sector, mixed into 25 tables of 10 participants each, with a facilitator guiding small group breakout discussions throughout the day. I was one of 25 facilitators and participated in a one-morning training event the day before, organized by employees of Arab, a design consultant firm 100 RC contracted to handle day-to-day operations. Throughout the kickoff event, we engaged in a variety of activities intended to collectively think through the city's resilience challenges. In 100 Resilient Cities lingo, this means contextually specific shocks and stressors that disrupt systemic functioning and hold out the threat of catastrophic breakdown. To put this in Michel Colon's terms, the challenge in these initial stages of resilience planning is one of problem formation. How might indeterminate issues of social and ecological complexity be rendered into determinate problems that resilience initiatives can address? One of the key tools for structuring this reflection is Arab's City Resilience Index. The index breaks down resilience into 4 overarching dimensions: economy and society, infrastructure and ecosystems, leadership and strategy, and health and well-being. It disaggregates each dimension into 3 goals, then further disaggregates these into qualitatively measurable indicators. This structured the breakout discussions. We asked participants to name and collectively rank order what they thought were major shocks and stresses. Participants then identified indicators where they felt the city's performance was strong and weak. We gave each participant 3 green and 3 red stickers, and they placed them into the indicators they thought were appropriate. Resilience planners then aggregated these results to create a visual representation of relative strengths and weaknesses in regional governance. Greater Miami and the Beach's strengths reflect local government's experience with disaster response and preparedness, while the weaknesses reflect the region's history of segregated, sprawl-oriented suburban growth and exclusionary governance. Participants recognized the region's struggle to provide reliable communications and mobility, empower a broad range of stakeholders, support livelihood and employment, ensure social stability, security, and justice, and provide and enhance natural and man-made assets. Following the kickoff event, the region's chief resilience officers used this data along with 2,000 public surveys and resilience challenges and input from technical experts in local government and private sector consultants to produce a resilience assessment that identified 6 discovery areas. These are areas where, in 100 RC terminology, complexity presents a unique set of challenges and opportunities. In analytical terms, these are sites where existing governance practices and techniques might be reimagined and recalibrated in response to these concerns. Here, we can begin to recognize how the resilience planning process transformed Miami's indeterminate and opaque Black geographies into transparent indeterminate issues relevant to specific interest groups that could be addressed through resilience initiatives. Historical experiences of negligent public service provisioning, racial discrimination and exclusion, segregation and violence were gradually sifted into specific discovery areas. In effect, these moves rendered embodied experiences of racial violence and abandonment legible not only as technical problems, but also in terms of a functional essence. These experiences became valued and recognized as part of the background conditions of the greater Miami urban system, which could improve or detract from systemic performance. The 100 RC planning process thus subsumed centrifugal resilience and the focus on addressing historical and present insecurities beneath the technical, ethical, and political imperatives of centripetal resilience and its focus on future-oriented threats to property and property interests. But how did this subsumption occur? As David Chandler has recently demonstrated, resilience marks a transformation of liberal governance around principles of second-order cybernetics. This recognizes that observers are always part of the complex system they are observing. There's no transcendental principle of judgment, the market, or the social that will determine whether governance intervention is good or bad. Governing complexity becomes what Riddle and Weber refer to as a wicked problem, an indeterminate problem that does not fall within any single disciplinary field of expertise, that has potentially multiple valid solutions depending on the problem solver's perspective, and that lacks a stopping rule that can identify when a problem has been solved. Governing complexity operates through what I've elsewhere called a will to design, an ethos or drive to reduce the world to rational abstractions that can be functionally synthesized to produce suboptimal yet satisfying solutions. This designerly ethos lies at the heart of resilience initiatives. Designerly techniques of synthesis suffused 100 resilient cities planning events. For example, focus group activities held at the agenda-setting discovery area workshops sought to tease out distinct forms of knowledge on complexity by bringing together individuals from diverse backgrounds across the region in order to share their experiences, interests, and goals in a common setting with resilience planning officials. In designerly terms, these activities are what design theorist Richard Buchanan calls placements, techniques that allow a designer to visualize a problem from different perspectives and develop a more complex, although by no means totalizing, vision of issues at hand. Placements, in turn, allow the designer, in consultation with the client, to synthesize diverse interests into tractable, if partial, satisfying solutions. In Miami, these solutions took the form of 59 action items in the Resilient 305 strategy. These are specific actions that seek to address the negative systemic impacts social inequalities create. And they include things like maximizing opportunity zones to increase private sector investment in marginalized communities, enhancing energy efficiency to increase home affordability, and utilizing inclusive zoning and municipal finance to increase affordable housing. In other words, these action items seek to accommodate the systemic effects of historical and contemporary forms of racialized violence and exclusion. Here, we can identify the ethical and political effects of design-driven resilience techniques deployed in GMB. Black geographies of struggle against racial violence become one partial and bounded perspective, ontologically and epistemologically equivalent to other experiences and knowledge of social and environmental change. The challenge for resilience planners is to design ways of synthesizing these perspectives into actionable items that can improve systemic performance. Designerly techniques thus transform sociospatial differences produced through decades of racialized political struggle into ontological differences, nothing more or less than distinct bounded forms of information in the complex urban system of GMB, amenable to functional synthesis with other forms of equally partial and bounded knowledge from technical experts, public surveys, developers, vulnerability maps, and so on. To conclude, we can note that as cities founded on white supremacy plan for resilience, many of the most innovative and challenging visions of resilience emanate out of the histories of struggle for survival, dignity, and joy in hostile and unlivable social and physical environments racial capitalism has produced. Where design-driven resilience seeks to render social and spatial difference legible as diverse interests in the local economy, centrifugal visions of resilience call into question the social and psychological investments in white property that underwrite South Florida governance. For these visions originate not in the desire to protect and secure continued growth in property value, but rather in the everyday practices and forms of knowledge bound up in surviving and resisting recurring racialized vulnerabilities and insecurities. The issue moving forward is not to oppose resilience, but rather to create ways of understanding and opposing a world, in this case, the highly racialized political economy of Greater Miami and the beaches, that presents centripetal visions of resilience as the only option to address sociospatial inequalities.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alice Hovorka, and I'm finally zooming in from Toronto, Canada, and I'm serving as the moderator for this session. Thank you so much to Jessica Alvarez, our producer for this session, which got us started this morning. And thank you especially to all of the presenters who offered these brilliant talks on the important metabolisms topic of race and gender equity and cultural identity. A couple of takeaway points from me as a moderator to pull these presentations together. Our presenters did a wonderful job illuminating the ways in which the natural landscape, built landscape, and cultural landscape work together. They intersect and they connect with one another, and how we need to unpack those in considerations of understanding resilience and planning for it. And the second message stemming from these for me is looking at resilient design, methodologies, developments, and how we need to consider positionalities and systems of race and gender in response to socio-ecological threats and challenges. I'm going to get right into the question and answer period. I'm going to encourage all of the attendees to use the Q&A tab on Zoom to submit your questions. I'm going to ask all of our presenters to join me with their videos. And I'm going to throw out a first question to all of our presenters, because I'm interested in what resonates with you from your fellow presenters' talks. What is it that shed a light bulb moment for you, or something that you'd love to consider in your own work? So I'll invite Jaime, Antonio, Didi, Kevin, Ricardo, and Steve to turn on your cameras, and feel free to jump in to answer the question.
Oh, we need to be allowed to turn our cameras on.
Apologies. I will ask Jessica to make those arrangements. She's able to do so from her end. And Jaime, are you able to share your thoughts?
Sure, yeah, I can start. So I believe that I saw various things in common. The first one is the need for immediate education in all these places where we intervened. The second is this need for self-sufficiency. And the third, I mean, as I can see from all the presentations, a requirement to invest in appropriate technologies. Nevertheless, I saw four things that were missing. One, this idea that, I mean, when we intervene in these foreign countries, we're acting as imperialists. I mean, we somehow say, we know that this is better for you, that you should be like us because we have this and you don't have that. But in a way, I mean, when we went to Haiti, we noticed that they were not interested in cash, they were not interested in money, they were not interested in many things for, I mean, that were important to us. They were more interested in notions of eudaimonia, happiness. Then this also the notion of capitalism. I mean, because we're trying to make money out of these things when in reality, I mean, they have no interest in that. I mean, sometimes that's not the most important thing in their immediate lives. And then the third will be that there's this sociocultural problem, which has to do with, in Haiti, particularly with the idea of corruption. I mean, there's corruption all the way through, and the wrong idea of ethics of utilitarianism when we say that, I mean, when we approach things from the hands of the most powerful rather than the most disadvantaged. And the fourth is what Kevin talked about in his presentation, this notion of living with water and approaching it from what he called the centrifugal resilience aspect. In other words, making sure that we can be focusing on this notion of global population migrations, which is a fact of the future, the abandonment of coastal cities and settlements, because that's going to be common human sense. I mean, nobody's going to live in a city that is 3 feet underwater. So adaptation is operatively tentative, in my opinion, But the thing that we need to think really strongly about is this notion of future mobility, I mean, mobility of population, change, and the foundation of new cities in high coastal areas rather than adapting, I mean, to live with water all the way up to our necks. I mean, that's what I've noticed very briefly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. I wonder if Didi, you wanted to join in. You had taken your mute off, so I'm going to mute off. So I'm going to let you express your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I would echo my previous, speaker, say that we need to send that we cannot have one solution that could fit, all. We need to create solutions that really acknowledge the structural issues which affect, the marginalized groups, in terms of women, Black people. We have to be able to move the response from, as I said, surface level to structural level. We need to center our interventions, on the specific needs, those specific groups, in tackling, issues of racial injustices, issues of neocolonialism. That, I would add to that.
Thank you, Didi. Kevin, you've come off mute, so I'll offer space for you.
Yeah, thanks, Alice, and thanks, everyone. To sort of piggyback on what Didi and Jaime said as well, I think a key point is that resilience as a guiding sort of concept, sort of guiding how we think and understand change, really sort of normalizes a functionalist approach to understanding human environment relations. And I think, like Didi said, sort of foregrounding the importance and the continued relevance of structural dynamics that continue to operate even in what are nominally equity-oriented initiatives is absolutely essential to foreground those structural dimensions. And I think especially, sort of as mobility becomes a greater problem, as both Jaime said and Didi said in her presentation as well, mobility is just compounding, and it's topologically reconfiguring how those structural dynamics intersect with each other. And so that intersectionality and how it's being complicated by new mobility pressures.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Ricardo, Antonio, Steve, thoughts to offer?
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks to everyone here this morning. In listening to the different presentations, I understand the need for empowerment and justice, and I think that comes in large part through employment, jobs. And I'm reminded of a situation in Santiago de Cuba, which has similar characteristics as Port-au-Prince, because it's on the same geological plate, and they get hurricanes and earthquakes. And after Hurricane Sandy, they were just hammered. They're still recovering. But there was one great example of reconstruction where the church rebuilt the cathedral. They reached out to Italian experts, right, who have been rebuilding domes for centuries. And they educated the local workforce. They employed 300 people for a number of years, which offered, some stability to all of those families. And they developed their building crafts, right? They're building techniques, their technologies that then they can apply to their own kind of domestic houses. In the Bahamas, we also saw the value of wood frame construction in the Caribbean. The flexibility of the wood structure and the fact that you can grow, the forest is a renewable source. I think the one other thing comes to mind, looking at the project in Costa Rica and the value of integrating both the natural landscapes and the built landscapes. I think that protecting our forestry, our material sources for continued development and building in places like the Caribbean is really important. And I think that that kind of economic stability that comes with a job and with a tradition that continues, that extends the cultural identity of the place, offers a glimpse of hope.
Antonio, do you want to jump in quickly? I'm going to start to shut things down soon. Apologies, but go ahead.
Okay, I will go fast. Or perhaps we're in different locations. I think that we see these problems more than like an opportunities to develop or recover some things that were lost or they being lost. And I think that an important thing is the education of these processes or changes, because many people that are direct affected by these changes, they don't know why or if these problems will continue.